to start with a small final discussion. We like to start with some impression we had, so not very concluding or whatever, but more impressions, what we take with us. And I think it was so diverse that it's also clear. I took with me a lot, I will take with me a lot, but it's not so that I can conclude. I cannot, and I think all the others. Maybe we do that in a year, in the follow-up. Yeah? So we all will say some small input, and then we open it and would be very happy to know what you want to take with you from this conference.
So what she very politely wanted to say is that it is up to you to wrap it up all together, and we just give some more diverse impressions. To come back to our CRC, one of our main concerns is to shift the paradigm of alterity studies or the analysis of dichotomies to a new research paradigm, if you want it big, the analysis of comparisons. And we hope that with doing an analysis of the practice of comparison, we can overcome this thinking in dichotomies and all the shortcomings that came along with it. Our main research question is how did the thing we are used to call the Western modernity come into existence? And we believe that the doing of comparisons was crucial for that entity, if you would like to name it an entity, came into existence. And behind that, we are asking, how do actors order and at the same time change the world while they are doing comparisons? And I think we had so many really intriguing examples during the last 2.5 days for this. So the basic question is, can we somehow come to a new understanding of what provokes historical change and what is the role of the doing of comparison within that new theory of historical change? For us, as we have many different sub-projects, and this is similar to the impression I had during the last 2.5 days, that there are many interesting cases, but the next step we are have to do is making out of this multi-layered, very colorful examples, kind of patterns of comparison, what we call communities of comparison. Well, if we talk of actors that compare in a similar way, we talk of communities of comparison, and we are very much interested in how specific patterns of practices of comparison became hegemonic. And also, again, here, I feel that we had some very telling examples here. What I learned and what I really found most interesting, or maybe I should not compare, what I found very interesting is the examples that pointed to how hegemonic comparisons, which quite often were European-based comparisons, were rejected or transformed or also adapted, and that this also could be a kind of resistance against these hegemonic comparisons. But I think we should go further in this direction and ask more for the subaltern and voices and local about the local knowledge. But well, okay, there's a lot to do still.
Okay, so I'll briefly summarize 3 points. I took many more from all of your papers, but I will just mention these 3 that really struck me as kind of happening in many regions, and also I had the feeling temporarily in different times. The first, foreign or indigenous knowledge, just new knowledge, and its contextualization by Europeans mostly in our cases, which we saw in Tina's paper, I think very well, also in Peter Mancall's talk, and different manners of making that new knowledge intelligible for Europeans, including the problem of translation, so comparison and translation. Then the point of temporal comparison that came out in different talks. So I think Dr. Camacho's talk, for example, which compared in the Philippines, compared marriage temporally. And then also, again, Peter Mancall's talk, where we had this comparison of European civilizational stages in order to sort of figure out what the civilizational stage was that the Europeans were seeing in the Americas, to make sense of that. So these comparisons that kind of then bleed into this whole idea of European kind of civilizational superiority. And as a last point, what I found very interesting was this idea of, and I'm using Sophie Hüglin's petrification terminology here, is this kind of petrification, if you will, of comparative practices in travel accounts. In the, as we saw in Eloise Wright's talk, these gazetteers and the Malaspina expeditions. So these preformed, almost preformed kind of questionnaires that had a specific idea of comparing, of gathering information for the empire, within the empire and across empires. So that is another point that I found very interesting to see. Thanks.
Yeah, well, this is kind of difficult. No, it works, thanks. I would just like to highlight one aspect about our approach and the productiveness of all of your papers concerning this approach. We are dealing with similarities and differences when we are talking about practices of comparisons. And it struck me as particularly fruitful in one historical epoch that was the subject of a number of excellent papers here, that was the Enlightenment, because it usually is viewed as an epoch in which the assumption of equality takes a universalist touch and is at the heart of the world conception, the entire world conception of the whole epoch. And what I found really interesting in a number of papers, like in yours, Demetrius Udell, or in Alexander Honnold's, or in the paper on Jones and translations of Eastern poetry, and a number of other papers, is that the approach of describing practices of comparison or of comparing, starting out from a distribution of similarity and difference, can take so many different shapes in a way, and it offers the possibility of presenting very differentiated images of the epoch, whether it concerns the Wissenschaften vom Menschen or the way aesthetics are conceived, European aesthetics in relation to Eastern aesthetics, or, in other fields, or the relationship between homogeneous science, or a science which is describing homogeneous aspects of the world, like astronomy, and how it gets into interaction with geography in order to produce difference. And that was a case which I find particularly interesting, that you need assumptions of equality or similarity to produce and to be able to describe difference. I think this is one aspect in which we can paradigmatically see how far we can get with this approach, being focused on practices of comparing. And I'm very thankful to all of you who have made possible to see the productivity of comparison in that respect.
And because this is a podium's discussion, I start now saying that I totally disagree with Kirsten Kramer. And I'm totally fed up about all this. The Enlightenment is special here. It's the first time. It's all here. Never before.
I didn't say that.
So I think one of the great things that impressed me here so much are these many ways where it was this productive fruitfulness of the approach of comparison was seen everywhere and every time. Yeah, and of course, having said so much about enlightenment is something special. But if you are not a specialist for enlightenment, you often think, yeah, but it's not so easy. Yeah, people just say it's special. They don't say what is special. And you also certainly know that always you say the first time, and somebody comes and says, no, we had it too. And it's if you are the one who says you had it too, that's also annoying. It's not only to hear, it's also to say it. Yeah. But what I really think is, and I think this conference made it very clear, is my hope that it's not the same and it's similar. Yeah. So you have this universal ideas, for example. It may be because of Christianity, everything is created by God, or it may be because of nature law. And this is of course not the same, and still it's both universal. And I hope that not only after this next 2 years, but after the next 10 years, because we really get the 12 years, we will have an answer to see, yeah, you all come back, of course, we will see how is it different, yeah? How can we, with similarity and difference, see a difference between Enlightenment universalism, Christian universalism, Chinese universalism, yeah? So I really hope we go on there. My second point, I think I already talked too much, is I want to say something about Angelika said about European modernity and the emergence of the idea of superiority. It struck me with a paper of Volker Bauer that it's an important point if it goes from information, from the contact zone, from the cultural encounter to a more the production of knowledge. Yeah? So we had so many interesting cases here, what was in the Philippines, what was in China, and there were always people compared. We have the indigenous knowledge or the foreign things Eleonora talked about. So you have special tertia, and my feeling is that often looking from the case of India, early modern, before the British, this is not about superiority or so. But then you bring all these contact zones with their comparisons together and make, how many books were there? 70, 80 books, and compare everything, and then you have to bring it in an order. Yeah? So you put it beside each other, but you also have to bring it in order, and all these different tertia. So they use very different tertia, certainly in Mexico than in Japan. But if you bring it all together there, you can only choose special ones. And I think this is the moment where the idea of a European non-comparability emerged. But also a thing I want to go deeper into it.
In incomparability are quite good sort of bridges. First of all, coming to lasting remembrances of a conference, one could have a look at the hashtag, and this is what I did for you. So, and we find a world of diversity, because what you find is this, for example. What you find is the childcare conference and the explanation to the bulldog, which is the hashtag itself is also related to the Cannabis Capital Convention Amsterdam. So if you want to have a sort of a different sameness to the same hashtag, you could have a look at this. Having said that, what I find so striking, having heard these many fascinating papers, was how you made me think about sameness in different ways and also about different differences. And I think it was really interesting also to look at the terms that you employed, and which was sometimes terms we also employed in our vocabulary, in our Vokabelheft, of course, but sometimes in very different ways. So we have, when thinking about sameness, we have parallels, likening, identification, identity. When thinking about different differences, we have contrast, dichotomies, distinctions. And we have, very importantly, mentioned by Alexander Hunold, the scaling of differences, the relative difference in contrast to contrast. So all this taken together, I think this really shows how important it is to go beyond othering and think about the relation, the different and divergent relations that comparata may have. But what I wanted to say most of all as a sort of outlook is, I think that the conference has also shown how much political character comparing has, having looked at many examples where it served legitimizing or emancipatory purposes. And I just want to show you a very small example of how that plays out today. I sort of robbed that from a fellow medievalist, but these are, for example, sort of historical comparisons nowadays made by right-wing groups saying, okay, we need the spirit of 1492 again to fight immigration. And I think we as sort of experts of comparison also have something to say about comparisons like these, probably not just like addressing specific comparisons, but rather explaining of how comparisons contribute to create a thus and a them, how it contributes to social reality. So I think the floor is open probably also for considerations of past and present comparisons. Very much like to know what your impressions. There will all be some administration stuff at the end, but first we want to stay academic.
I just have a question. How did you come up with the title?
Eleonora?
I don't know. That was a sort of one of those moments. It just made sense because of several of us are working on projects that are either working with contact situations or that are already set in a colonial setting, and then alliterations work. I don't know. So
it was a nice alliteration.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Rhetorically, it works very well. The CCC, right?
What would be?
Because there's something in the U.S. history.
What would be your Is there a criticism or like?
No,
why?
it's just informational. I just wanted to know because you know it's.
We knew about the cannabis, of course.
Well, now that would also be a very interesting conference.
Oh, you asked for. Oh, sorry. No, cannabis would have.
There was a subtitle too.
So
It's very long.
Yes,
it's very German. Yeah, I was going to say that. That we didn't put unter besonderer Berücksichtigung von something. Yeah, that would be the usual case, and it would be like six lines or something.
No, but what I found so striking was that in our discussions, actually a fourth C came up, that is competition, which features very prominently in the SFB, but which we haven't put in the title. But so we could also have a much sort of more unique title with having a fourth CCCC.
And
maybe.
not forget conflict.
yeah. No, but actually the idea was really to grasp what Angelika said at the beginning, which we didn't tell you before starting the conference, but briefly. Well, very briefly, that we are not dealing with practices of comparing in a neutral context, but considering context and actors, you're always in asymmetric situations, and these are, if you view them in a transcultural perspective, these are described by contact, conquest, colonization very often.
Eloise White had
I also had a question about the title. Actually, a couple of people yesterday spoke of it as a 3-stage process, and that had not occurred to me to think of that before they said that. Is that what was in your minds, or no? Just because it seems to me, obviously, these things.
I mean, we are all working in different sub-projects of the whole thing. And of course, when we thought that it would be interesting to do a workshop together, we looked out for something that could combine everything together. And speaking now of the perspective of our sub-project, but similarly this also applies to the others, is that when you look at the 1898 wars, or around 1900, then you see that all these 3 dimensions come together at the same time.
Right.
So if you're looking from the US perspective, the empire is becoming an anti-colonial colonial empire, and of course there is contact, but there's also conquest. If you look at the Philippines, we heard about that, and yeah, I think it is so interesting if we are looking at practices of comparing that. you always have to look at the actors, who is comparing what to what, and who is allowed to compare what to what, and who is not, and what's the kind of backdrop against which an actor is comparing. And this, of course, is heavily influenced by the contextual situation, or the situational context, however you would like to name it. And this shapes the way of how comparing is carried out.
Stefanie Zemle?
I'd like to start with telling you how I profited from your concept and from the engagement with your research paradigms. I learned that comparing is a process, at times a very long process, in which people, groups, institutions are involved, so that comparison is not usually developed out of a certain situation only, but has an historical environment. And that was really interesting for me. So it's not only an intellectual engagement with something. That's what I learned. So I think the term practices really makes sense in this concept. And so then again, I have two new thoughts which came up during the conference. And the first one is that I became really interested in how methods of comparing, and not certain comparisons or attitudes themselves, influenced each other, especially between subaltern groups and hegemonic groups. I think that can be really interesting, because the actors or societies that were compared also did, when people asked for it, did influence the comparison and the practice of comparison itself. So I think that can be really interesting. And that leads me to my second idea, which is the non-comparability you were just highlighting, and when it emerged, the non-comparability of Europe or the West. And I think it, at least concerning Africa, it often emerged when the other, whoever that may be in a certain situation, or any other, started to compare the same way. Because that really challenged the person or institution comparing. But I haven't really thought about it. I think that when somebody else who is compared starts comparing the same way and adapts the mode of comparison, this challenges the person comparing, because he's not anymore in this very singular, powerful position. So I think that does disrupt something. And I've never really thought about colonizer relationships that way, that the acts of comparing influenced each other and really challenged colonial rule, for instance, in my case, that large. That's quite fascinating for me, but I think we've just all started reflecting on processes like that.
Just briefly wanted to say that before. I'm extremely pleased with how all of you actually, for yourselves agreed to sort of think with us in this mode of thought. So that, I think, was for all of us very, very fruitful as well. So, and all of your papers were, as you see, are sort of bringing us very much forward as well.
Volker Bauer?
Geht das wieder? Ja, okay, ich habe immer Angst bei dem hier. Maybe I'm stating the obvious, but what I think is important for me, and I mean that this does not only go for this conference, but also for the whole SFB, is, I mean, I grew up in historiography where comparison was a cutting edge, yeah? It was these national containers that were compared, and then it was pretty clear that was a bit simplistic. And then there was things like cultural exchange, cultural transfer, and then it was entanglement and all this. And what I find is quite intriguing that your understanding of comparing in a praxeological way just sort of, in a Hegelian sense, is the Aufhebung of all these formal things. And that's what I really like. And what I heard here sort of, Yeah, well, in brackets, and this conference makes me quite confident that it actually works. Yeah, so it's not just well, it really pays out, I think, to really pursue this new avenue. I think it was quite convincing for me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we don't have dusk yet, but still, if you see some owls flying right around, that's great. No, thank you very much. That's really good, and I think it's also the idea of having some sort of self-reflective dimension to like scholarship itself that is very much at the heart, and also all the question of university ranking and sort of self-positioning in the scientific field, which also go together with comparing, of course. So I think this is very much at the heart of it. Sarah Melmer?
I'm afraid. Okay, not too close. Well, yeah, I was. It was really interesting to hear all these different talks and presentations, and after having heard all of them, I was thinking about maybe we can get to kind of general schemes or general structures that can maybe unite all of these topics. And I was thinking about 4 questions actually, like. Who compares, well, including the actor or mediator, I would maybe call it, to whom is he or she directing the comparison, so the role of the addressee. Who is it? Is it a foreigner, or is it like a indigenous compatriot? I don't know how to call it. Then the 3rd question would be, or 3rd and 4th, what does he or she compare? So, meaning the points of reference that could be time, space, or place, culture, including language and religion, ethnicity and race, or race. The next question would be, how does he or she compare? That would be the practices of comparing, actually, the practice as such. And then I was thinking about the practice of comparing as maybe a kind of practice of translating, because we have dealt a lot with translations of verbal language as well as of pictorial language. And the last question would be, why does he or she does it? So the function or the intention of the practice of comparing, and that could be, for example, to make something exotic intelligible for someone who does not know it, or to differentiate oneself from another, or vice versa, and in general to order the world, what you already said. So I was thinking in maybe it is useful to structure a bit the whole thing.
Well, thank you very much. We are particularly glad that you brought up the question, because we were discussing beforehand whether we should do the bombing with the theoretical concept, which we elaborated for the Antrag for the SFB. And in fact, as you probably imagine, we do have like a model how to, and it coincides in a very interesting way what you just said. The basic idea is that we started out from a hermeneutics of comparison, which presupposes at least two entities, the so-called comparata, which need to be compared. This is what you addressed at what is being compared. Then you have usually, the assumption, some sort of assumption of equality, similarity, something like that, which is condensed into one or several tertia. And we, the praxeological turn consists in presupposing actors and context, situational context, which would probably cover what are the motivations, the intentions, because this is implied by the actor, and also in a way the context, the media context. And also, theoretically, we can account for translation processes, which need to be addressed, of course, but they are like included, or they can be addressed by the model. So I'm really glad you said that now, because we refrained from confronting you with a theoretical model at the beginning. This gets some kind of a missionary and scary aspect. So now we got the chance to articulate and formulate the basics.
Somebody else I haven't seen. Somebody wants to say something? Yes, please.
Well, mine are a little more along the way of something anecdotal, but as I was working and preparing this, you guys really helped me kind of get past a little writing block I had. So what I realized in my writing, getting ready for this, is that reciprocity, or when you're trying to establish reciprocity, involves a collection of ongoing comparisons. And as a literary person, literary scholar, I'm always interested in juxtapositions. And I thought that that juxtaposition, we could think of it as a willingness to leave certain comparisons unresolved. And that for whatever reasons, there's a lot of that out there. To choose which comparata, I hope I used that the right way, will exist in sort of ongoing tension, to kind of choose this and let that be. And in colonial Mexico and colonial Latin America, I see that a lot. What are the things we can just let them coexist and then see what happens? So, like I say, pretty anecdotal, not too refined.
Well, but thank you for this, because I really find that this reciprocity is key when it comes also to the methodology of comparing. So if what you mentioned, that there was a time, once upon a time in history, the comparative methodology was the key methodology to use, but still I think that it is a very good way to do historical analysis, but we should, of course, be aware of some pitfalls. And I would say that because comparing is never neutral, we had that before, so reciprocity is a key issue, a key concern that should be should be looked at. And I found it so amazing in your talk that you said that Valeriano already asked for reciprocity. And this really was amazing. And I really made some, highlighting at that, because I feel it is really, it really, in a way, shows the hidden agenda of many comparisons if you ask for reciprocity.
Have I not seen anybody who had the urgent wish to say something? Julian Gärtner, thank you.
There's one more point I was interested in, or what I thought was very fascinating observing, is so in this whole model we have more or less sketched out in our research project, it's the context that still baffles me all the time, where I'm, what belongs to the context, how does the context interact maybe reciprocally with the actor, with the comparator, with the tertium, how does it change it, and vice versa. And what I thought was interesting was observing that point from talk to talk, from paper to paper, how different contexts made a difference. And I think that's something we might need to focus more and also challenge our own model of comparing a little bit more, how and differentiate more how different comparata and tertia have one context, then change a context, bring other things into context, and to show the dynamics or the changes these practices actually do performatively to pin them down a little bit more precisely.
Well, I just want to follow up on that, because one of the things that struck me is that I don't go to so many sort of huge conferences, but those are the only ones where you get such a variety of different topics. And to what I guess would like to applaud you for is the way in which you were able to bring together so many different, I mean, from the astronomy to the archaeology, and, from China to, Latin America, around this sort of, this concept. I don't know if you want to call it a methodology, because I know that might be problematic. Hermeneutics, you're going to decide on that later, but we might want to think of it in terms of knowledge production, right? What does this say about our own disciplinary formations, right, where we're actually located when sharing different methodologies and different sort of bases of content, uses of evidence, that we're able to have this really productive conversation, right? So perhaps at the institutional level, we can also sort of push this to say, well, do we need a department of comparisons or some other kind of way of thinking about these questions that you can be able to see across fields and across methodologies? For me, I find that very, very provocative, right? Because I have not in such a small space been able to see such a wide variety of different kinds of contents and approaches to something, and yet to share a similar kind of preoccupation. That's really quite impressive.
Maybe I can just link that to the discussion of the SFB, whether a juxtaposition of things really already makes a comparison. I think this is an issue we tend to discuss over and over again. And I think that what you just said proves that it's always very important that we have the actors in the whole process, because it's you have listened to this great variety of things, and some of you might have taken that as an invitation to compare, as Julian just said, while others probably just choose and picked, I don't know, but I think this makes it such an interesting and dynamic topic, both as a scholarly practice and as a sort of scholarly object or subject to research.
I kind of wanted to respond to what Sarah just said, because I also brought that up in a panel discussion, the fundamental act of translation and the role languages themselves play. Because what I found really interesting is that when a phenomenon, entity, group of people, persons, singular persons are compared, that usually what is focused is the comparison itself, whereas implicitly you also label what you do compare. And especially in a CCC process of conquest colonization, this is very important, I think. So I think of my own topic of terming the Poro secret societies for the first time when comparing them, and also of Volker Bauer's presentation when kingdoms in the first place, I think, kingdoms were compared. So calling them states either or kingdoms does make a difference, although this is not the goal of the comparison, but what just implicitly is established. And you cannot really go behind that if you compare afterwards, I think. So there is a certain regime of comparison already established, in a very basal way, and I think this could be very productive for your reflection.
I would give the word to Eleonora, if I really don't. Yeah. Eleonora.
There is no sort of, you're not being forced to discuss, and I think I love the way that we have brought the points together, and also from your impressions now of these 3 days. So thank you very much for participating in all of this, and for coming, and for giving your great papers.
And thank you to you, Eleonora, because in fact there are 5 of us, but Eleonora did the main job here, and she really did it wonderfully.